For years, America lived in fear of an enemy it could not see. Behind the closed borders of the Soviet Union, hidden from every camera and every spy, the Soviets were believed to be building an arsenal of nuclear missiles, enough to destroy the United States many times over. American leaders spoke of a missile gap, a terrifying Soviet advantage in the weapons that could end the world. The fear shaped elections, drove military spending, and kept a nation awake at night. And the most frightening part was that no one actually knew. The Soviet Union was a sealed box, and America was guessing. Then, on an August morning in 1960, a small capsule fell out of the sky over the Pacific Ocean, was snatched out of the air by an airplane trailing a hook, and was rushed to a laboratory. Inside was a roll of film, and what that film revealed, photographed from orbit by a satellite the existence of which was one of America's deepest secrets, would overturn everything the United States believed about its enemy. This is the story of America's first spy satellite, and what it detected when it finally opened its eye over the Soviet Union. August 19, 1960. The sky above the Pacific Ocean, several hundred miles southwest of Hawaii. A C-119 transport aircraft, a twin-boomed cargo plane that the crews called the Flying Boxcar, flew in a slow, careful pattern at high altitude, trailing behind it a strange apparatus, a long cable ending in a hook and a trapeze-like rig. The crew was attempting to do something that had never been successfully done in the history of human flight. They were trying to catch a falling object out of the open sky. The object descending toward them was a capsule about the size of a small barrel, falling from the edge of space beneath a parachute. It had been ejected from a satellite in orbit around the Earth, had survived the fiery plunge back through the atmosphere, and was now drifting down over the Pacific, where the recovery aircraft was waiting. Inside the capsule was a roll of photographic film. But this was no ordinary film. It was film that had been exposed in orbit by a camera looking down at the surface of the Earth, and specifically at the surface of the Soviet Union. It was, if the recovery succeeded, the first photographic intelligence ever gathered from space. The recovery was the most difficult part of the entire operation, and it had failed many times before. The capsule could not simply be allowed to fall into the ocean, because seawater would damage the film, and the capsule might sink before it could be retrieved. The plan was to catch it in midair, with the aircraft flying its hook through the parachute lines as the capsule descended, snagging it and reeling it aboard. It was an audacious technique that required precise flying and considerable luck. On this attempt, the crew flew their pattern, lined up on the descending parachute, and put their hook through the lines. The capsule was caught. The aircraft reeled it aboard. The film was safe. What the crew of that aircraft had just recovered, and what no one outside a small circle of cleared officials yet knew, was a roll of film that contained more information about the Soviet Union than years of previous espionage had managed to gather. In a single pass over the Soviet landmass, the camera in orbit had photographed more Soviet territory than every American spy flight in history combined. The film held images of Soviet airfields, missile sites, military installations, and industrial facilities, photographed from orbit, beyond the reach of any Soviet defense. It was the answer to the question that had haunted American intelligence for years, the question of what the Soviet Union was actually building behind its closed borders. The capsule was rushed from the recovery aircraft to a laboratory, where the film would be developed and analyzed, and where American intelligence would finally see, with its own eyes, the truth about its enemy. What they would find would surprise them profoundly, and it would change the course of the Cold War. To understand why a roll of film mattered so much, it is necessary to understand the depth of the uncertainty that had gripped the United States throughout the late 1950 seconds. The Soviet Union was, in the most literal sense, a closed society. Its borders were sealed. Its internal movements were controlled. Foreign journalists were restricted. Foreign travelers were monitored. And the vast interior of the Soviet landmass, where its military and industrial facilities were located, was effectively invisible to the outside world. The United States, for all its wealth and technological capability, simply did not know what the Soviet Union was building. And in the nuclear age, that ignorance was terrifying. The specific fear that crystallized this uncertainty was the fear of the missile gap. After the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, demonstrating that it possessed rockets capable of reaching across continents, American anxiety about Soviet missile capability intensified dramatically. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, they could launch an intercontinental ballistic missile tipped with a nuclear warhead, and they could do so against the United States. The question was how many such missiles the Soviet Union possessed, and how quickly it was building more. And the honest answer, within American intelligence, was that no one knew. Into this vacuum of knowledge rushed fear, and the fear was actively fed by Soviet propaganda. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, understood the psychological value of appearing strong, and he made the most of it. He boasted, in a phrase that became famous, that the Soviet Union was producing missiles like sausages, rolling them off assembly lines in enormous numbers. He spoke of Soviet missile superiority. He used the apparent Soviet lead in rocketry as a weapon of intimidation, encouraging the West to believe that the Soviet Union held a decisive advantage in the weapons that mattered most. Whether these boasts were true, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated, the United States had no way to know, and in the absence of knowledge, it tended to assume the worst. The assumption of the worst had enormous consequences. The perceived missile gap became a central issue in American politics and military planning. It drove demands for increased defense spending, for the acceleration of American missile programs, for a buildup to match the Soviet arsenal that was believed to exist. It featured prominently in the presidential campaign of 1960, in which the missile gap was cited as evidence that the United States had fallen dangerously behind. The fear was not merely an abstraction. It shaped real decisions, real spending, and the real strategic posture of the United States, all based on an estimate of Soviet capability that rested on guesswork, propaganda, and fragmentary intelligence, rather than on actual knowledge. The danger of this situation extended beyond wasted spending. In the nuclear age, miscalculation could be catastrophic. If the United States believed the Soviet Union to be far stronger than it actually was, it might take aggressive or defensive actions that the real balance of power did not warrant. Actions that could provoke the very conflict everyone feared. Conversely, accurate knowledge of Soviet capability would allow the United States to calibrate its responses appropriately, to avoid both dangerous complacency and dangerous overreaction. In a confrontation between two nuclear-armed superpowers, accurate intelligence was not merely useful. It was potentially the difference between stability and catastrophe. And the United States did not have it. The fundamental problem was one of access. The information the United States needed was inside the Soviet Union, in the missile fields and air bases and factories of the Soviet interior, and the United States could not get to it. Spies on the ground provided fragments, but the Soviet security apparatus made human intelligence extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. The vast majority of the Soviet interior had never been photographed by any American camera. The United States was attempting to assess the most important strategic question of the age, the size and nature of the Soviet nuclear threat, while effectively blind. What it needed was a way to see inside the closed box of the Soviet Union, to photograph the missile fields and count the missiles, to replace guesswork with knowledge. The search for that capability would lead, eventually, to a camera in orbit. But the first attempt to see inside the Soviet Union would come not from space, but from an airplane flying higher than any aircraft had flown before. The first American solution to the problem of seeing inside the Soviet Union came from the air, in the form of an extraordinary aircraft called the U-2. developed in secret in the mid-1950s by the Lockheed Company under the direction of the legendary aircraft designer Kelly Johnson, the U-2 was built to do one thing supremely well: to fly higher than any other aircraft and to carry cameras over hostile territory at altitudes beyond the reach of enemy defenses. The U-2 could fly above 70,000 feet, more than 13 miles high, a height at which, it was believed, no Soviet fighter could reach it, and no Soviet missile could touch it. From that altitude, its cameras could photograph the ground below with remarkable clarity, resolving objects on the surface across a wide swath of territory. Beginning in 1956, the U-2 began flying missions over the Soviet Union, and the intelligence it gathered was invaluable. For the first time, the United States obtained actual photographs of Soviet territory, images of airfields, military installations, and industrial facilities that had previously been entirely hidden. The U-2 flights provided the first real evidence with which to assess Soviet capabilities, and that evidence began, even in these early years, to suggest that the Soviet missile threat might be smaller than the worst fears imagined. The U-2 was a triumph of American engineering and a vital source of intelligence, and for a few years it gave the United States a window into the closed Soviet world. But the U-2 had limits, and those limits were serious. The first limit was coverage. The U-2 was an aircraft, and it could photograph only the territory along its flight path. Each mission covered a corridor across the Soviet landmass, but the Soviet Union was enormous, the largest country on Earth, spanning 11 time zones, and a single aircraft, even flying repeated missions, could photograph only a fraction of it. Vast areas of the Soviet interior remained unphotographed, and the missile sites and military facilities the United States most needed to find might lie anywhere in that vast, unphotographed expanse. The U-2 could sample the Soviet Union, but it could not survey it comprehensively. The second limit was risk, and it was a limit that grew more severe with each passing year. The assumption that the U-2 flew beyond the reach of Soviet defenses had been true when the aircraft first began flying, but it was becoming less true as the Soviet Union improved its surface-to-air missiles. The Soviets were aware of the overflights, were deeply angered by them, and were working urgently to develop the capability to shoot down the high-flying intruder. American intelligence understood that the window during which the U-2 could fly safely over the Soviet Union was closing, that sooner or later the Soviets would develop a missile capable of reaching the U-2's altitude, and that when they did, an American aircraft and its pilot would be lost over hostile territory, with all the political consequences that would follow. The U-2 was living on borrowed time. That time ran out on May 1st, 1960. On that day, a U-2 piloted by Francis Gary Powers was flying a reconnaissance mission deep over the Soviet Union when a Soviet surface-to-air missile detonated near the aircraft, damaging it and sending it down. Powers survived, ejecting and parachuting to the ground, where he was captured by Soviet authorities. The incident was a catastrophe for the United States on multiple levels. The Soviets had shot down an American spy plane over their territory, proving that the U-2 was no longer safe. They had captured the pilot alive, giving them a propaganda prize and a witness, and they had recovered wreckage of the aircraft, including evidence of its reconnaissance mission. Khrushchev exploited the incident with great skill. The United States, not knowing that Powers had survived and been captured, initially issued a cover story claiming that a weather research aircraft had strayed off course. Khrushchev then revealed that the Soviets had the pilot alive and the wreckage intact, exposing the American cover story as a lie and humiliating the United States before the world. The incident wrecked a planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev, escalated Cold War tensions, and ended the U-2 overflights of the Soviet Union. The United States would not risk another aircraft over Soviet territory after the Powers shoot-down. The window that the U-2 had opened was now closed. The closing of that window left the United States in a desperate position. At the very moment when accurate intelligence about Soviet missile capability was most needed, when the missile gap fear was at its height, and the presidential campaign of 1960 was making it a central issue, the United States had lost its only means of photographing the Soviet interior. The U-2 was grounded over the Soviet Union. Human intelligence remained fragmentary and dangerous. The United States was blind again, and blind at the worst possible time. But the loss of the U-2 was not, as it might have seemed, the end of American reconnaissance over the Soviet Union. It was, in a sense, the final argument for a capability that had been developed in secret precisely because the planners had foreseen that the U-2 could not last. The future of American reconnaissance lay not in aircraft, which could be shot down, but in satellites, which flew in orbit, beyond the reach of any missile the Soviet Union possessed. And that future had a name, held in the deepest secrecy. It was called Corona. The idea that would solve the problem of seeing inside the Soviet Union had been taking shape, in secret, even before the U-2 was shot down. Its logic was elegant and, in retrospect, almost obvious. If aircraft could be shot down over Soviet territory, then the United States needed a reconnaissance platform that could not be shot down. A platform that flew so high and so fast that no Soviet defense could reach it. There was such a place. It was orbit. A satellite circling the Earth in orbit flew at an altitude of more than 100 miles, far beyond the reach of any surface-to-air missile, and it traveled at a speed of approximately 17,000 miles per hour, far too fast for any interceptor. A satellite in orbit could pass over the Soviet Union again and again, photographing its territory, and there was nothing the Soviet Union could do to stop it. There was also a question of law and sovereignty that worked, unexpectedly, in America's favor. When an aircraft flew over the Soviet Union, it violated Soviet airspace, an unambiguous intrusion that the Soviets had every right under international law to oppose by force, as they had with the U-2. But the status of orbital space was undefined. No nation had established a legal claim to the space above its territory at orbital altitudes, and the question of whether a satellite passing overhead constituted a violation of sovereignty was genuinely unsettled. The Eisenhower administration, with considerable foresight, had worked to establish the principle of freedom of space, the idea that orbital space was open to all, and that a satellite passing over a nation's territory did not violate its sovereignty. By the time Corona flew, this principle was becoming accepted, in part because the Soviet Union itself had established it by flying Sputnik over the territory of other nations without objection. A satellite could photograph the Soviet Union from orbit without committing the kind of clear violation that an overflying aircraft committed. President Eisenhower, who understood the strategic value of reconnaissance better than almost any president, authorized the development of a reconnaissance satellite as a matter of the highest priority and the deepest secrecy. The program that resulted was given the code name Corona, and it was concealed behind one of the most elaborate cover stories of the Cold War. To the public, and indeed to most of the government, the satellites being launched were part of a scientific research program called Discoverer, intended to study the space environment, to test the effects of orbital flight on biological specimens, and to develop the technology for returning objects from space. This cover story was entirely fictional as far as the true purpose was concerned, but it was maintained with great care, complete with press releases, scientific announcements, and an entirely plausible public narrative. Behind the Discoverer cover, the real Corona program pursued its actual mission, the photographic reconnaissance of the Soviet Union from orbit. The technical challenge of Corona was staggering, and it pushed the limits of what was possible in the late 1950 seconds and early 1960 seconds. The program had to build a camera capable of photographing the ground from orbit with enough resolution to be useful, to mount that camera in a satellite, to point it accurately at the Soviet Union as the satellite passed overhead, and to expose the film. But that was only the beginning of the problem. The film, once exposed, had to be returned to Earth, because there was no way in that era to transmit high-resolution images electronically from orbit. The satellite had to carry physical film, expose it over the Soviet Union, and then somehow deliver that film back to the ground, where it could be developed and analyzed. The solution to the film return problem was the audacious recovery system. The exposed film would be wound into a capsule. The capsule would be ejected from the satellite. It would re-enter the atmosphere protected by a heat shield, deploy a parachute, and descend toward a designated recovery area in the Pacific Ocean, where an aircraft would catch it in midair. Every element of this sequence was difficult, and the midair recovery was the most difficult of all. It required the capsule to survive re-entry, the parachute to deploy correctly, the capsule to descend into the recovery area, the recovery aircraft to find it, and the aircraft to fly its hook through the parachute lines and snag the capsule, all without damaging the precious film inside. It was a sequence of events that had to work perfectly, and in the early attempts, it did not work at all. The combination of these challenges, the orbital camera, the precise pointing, the film return, and the midair recovery, made the program one of the most technically ambitious efforts the United States had ever attempted. It was, in its way, as difficult as the early stages of the space program itself, and it was being pursued in total secrecy, behind a cover story, by a small team working under enormous pressure. The stakes could not have been higher. If Corona worked, it would give the United States the ability to photograph the entire Soviet Union from orbit, to count the missiles and find the airfields and assess the threat with actual knowledge rather than guesswork. If it failed, the United States would remain blind. The program had been authorized, the cover was in place, and the engineering effort was underway. What remained was to make it work, and making it work would prove to be a long and humiliating ordeal, because before Corona succeeded, it would fail, again and again and again. The early history of Corona was a history of failure so sustained and so complete that, in almost any other context, it would have led to the cancellation of the program. Beginning in early 1959, the United States launched satellite after satellite under the Discoverer cover, and one after another, they failed. The failures came in every conceivable form, at every stage of the extraordinarily complex sequence that a successful mission required. Rockets exploded on launch or shortly after. Satellites failed to reach orbit. Satellites reached orbit but malfunctioned. Cameras failed. Film jammed or broke. Recovery capsules failed to eject, or ejected but failed to re-enter properly, or re-entered but were lost at sea, or descended into the recovery area but were not caught. Each mission was a chain of difficult steps, and the failure of any single step meant the failure of the entire mission. For more than a year that chain broke, somewhere, every single time. The toll was relentless. Discoverer 1, launched in February 1959, failed to achieve a stable orbit. Discoverer 2, in April, reached orbit, but its recovery capsule came down in the wrong place, near the Arctic island of Spitsbergen, where it was lost and, it was feared, possibly recovered by the Soviets. The subsequent missions failed in their turn, through launch failures, orbital failures, camera failures, and recovery failures. The engineers would identify the cause of one failure, fix it, launch again, and encounter a different failure. The program was learning, with each attempt, what could go wrong, but the list of things that could go wrong seemed endless, and the successes refused to come. By the time the program had accumulated a dozen failures, the strain on the people involved had become immense. The failures were particularly difficult to bear because of the secrecy that surrounded the program. The Corona team could not share their struggle with the world, could not explain that they were attempting something unprecedented and difficult, could not receive the public understanding that might have eased the pressure. Worse, the Discoverer cover story required that the failures be explained publicly, in terms of the fictional scientific mission, which meant that the program's repeated failures became, in the public eye, the repeated failures of an American space effort, reinforcing the very impression of American inadequacy that the real program was meant to overcome. The team had to endure not only the private agony of repeated failure, but the public humiliation of having those failures attributed to a space program that appeared unable to succeed, all while being unable to reveal that the real mission was something far more important than the cover suggested. The pressure to cancel the program must have been considerable. After a dozen consecutive failures, with enormous sums spent and nothing to show for it, a less determined effort might well have been abandoned. The rational case for cancellation could have been made. The technology was clearly extraordinarily difficult. The failures showed no sign of ending. The money might be better spent elsewhere. And yet the program was not canceled, and the reason it was not canceled reveals something important about the American approach and about the stakes involved. The need for the intelligence was too great. With the U-2 grounded over the Soviet Union after the powers' shoot-down, Corona was the only path to the knowledge the United States desperately needed. The program had to succeed because there was no alternative, and so the failures were treated not as reasons to quit, but as lessons to be learned on the way to eventual success. This was the discipline that the American space effort had developed, and that distinguished it at its best. Failure was not concealed or denied or used as a reason for despair. It was analyzed. Each failed mission was studied to determine exactly what had gone wrong, and the lesson was incorporated into the next attempt. The approach was patient, methodical, and relentless. The engineers did not expect to succeed immediately. They expected to fail, to learn from the failure, and to fail less the next time, until the accumulated learning produced success. It was the same philosophy that would later carry the Apollo program to the moon, the conviction that a sufficiently difficult problem could be solved through persistent, disciplined effort, through the willingness to fail repeatedly in pursuit of an eventual success. Corona was an early and severe test of that philosophy, and the philosophy held. The 13th attempt, like the 12 before it, did not fully succeed. By the standards the program was reaching for, the first dozen and more missions were failures. But with each failure, the engineers had learned, had refined the rocket, the satellite, the camera, the recovery system. The problems were being solved, one at a time, through the accumulated experience of repeated attempts. And the team persisted, launching again, in the conviction that the next attempt, or the one after that, would finally bring together all the elements that had to work, and would deliver the prize that had eluded them for more than a year. The persistence would be rewarded. After 13 failures, after more than a year of humiliation endured in secret, the 14th attempt was being prepared, and it would become one of the most important successes in the history of American intelligence. The long ordeal of failure was about to end, and the eye in the sky was about to open at last. The mission that finally succeeded was Discoverer 14, launched on August 18, 1960, from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. By this point, the engineers had absorbed the lessons of more than a year of failures, and the satellite they launched incorporated countless refinements born of those failures. The rocket performed correctly, lifting the satellite into orbit. The satellite stabilized itself and oriented its camera toward the Earth. And as it passed over the Soviet Union, the camera did what 13 previous attempts had failed to accomplish. It photographed Soviet territory, exposing its film over the missile fields and air bases and installations of the closed Soviet interior, gathering the images that the United States had been trying for years to obtain. But exposing the film in orbit was only half the challenge. The film still had to come home. After the satellite completed its photographic passes, the recovery sequence began. The capsule containing the exposed film, a vehicle the program called the Bucket, separated from the satellite. It fired a small retro rocket to slow itself and drop out of orbit. It plunged back into the atmosphere, its heat shield absorbing the searing heat of re-entry. And then, having survived the descent through the atmosphere, it deployed its parachute and began to drift down toward the recovery area in the Pacific Ocean, southwest of Hawaii, where the recovery aircraft were waiting. The midair recovery technique was among the most remarkable operational procedures ever devised, and it had been the source of many of the program's failures. The principle was that a recovery aircraft, trailing a long cable with a hook and a trapeze-like rig, would fly through the parachute lines above the descending capsule, snag the parachute or its lines with the hook, and then reel the capsule aboard the aircraft. Catching the film in midair, rather than letting it fall into the ocean, served several purposes. It protected the film from seawater, it prevented the capsule from sinking before it could be recovered, and it ensured that the capsule, with its extraordinarily sensitive contents, did not fall into the wrong hands. But the technique was difficult in the extreme. The aircraft had to find the descending capsule, position itself precisely, and fly its hook through the parachute lines at exactly the right moment, all while both the aircraft and the capsule were moving. The recovery aircraft assigned to the task was a C-119 flying boxcar of the Air Force, crewed by airmen who had trained extensively for this peculiar mission. On the previous missions, when capsules had actually reached the recovery area, the mid-air catch had failed, the capsules falling into the ocean where some were recovered from the water and others were lost. The recovery crews had practiced the technique repeatedly, refining their approach, learning the timing, preparing for the day when a capsule would descend into their area, and they would have the chance to make the catch that mattered. On August 19, 1960, the day after the launch of Discoverer 14, that chance came. The recovery capsule descended into the Pacific recovery area beneath its parachute, and the C-119 crew flew their pattern, lined up on the descending parachute, and made their approach. The first pass missed, but the capsule was descending slowly enough that the aircraft could come around for another attempt. On a subsequent pass, the crew flew their hook through the parachute lines, and the hook caught. The capsule, with its precious film, was snagged in midair, and the crew reeled it aboard the aircraft. For the first time in history, an object had been recovered from orbit, caught in midair as it descended from space. The film was safe. The achievement was extraordinary on multiple levels. It was the first successful recovery of a payload from orbit in the history of spaceflight, a technical milestone of the first order. It came after 13 consecutive failures, a testament to the persistence that had refused to abandon the program, despite more than a year of disappointment. And most importantly, it delivered into American hands the first photographic intelligence ever gathered from space, the images of the Soviet Union that the United States had been desperate to obtain. The capsule was rushed from the recovery aircraft to a processing facility, where the film would be developed and the images analyzed by intelligence specialists who had waited years for this moment. The significance of what had been accomplished extended far beyond the single mission. The success of Discoverer 14 proved that the entire Corona concept worked. A satellite could be launched, could photograph the Soviet Union from orbit, could return its film to Earth, and the film could be recovered and analyzed. The capability that the United States had been pursuing through more than a year of failure had been demonstrated. And it was a capability that could be repeated, mission after mission, building a comprehensive photographic record of the Soviet Union that no aircraft could ever have gathered. The eye in the sky had opened, and unlike the U-2, it could not be shot down. The Soviet Union could do nothing to stop a satellite passing overhead at 17,000 miles per hour, more than 100 miles up. For the first time, the United States had a sustainable, secure, comprehensive means of seeing inside the closed box of the Soviet Union. And when the analysts developed the film from Discoverer 14 and began to study the images, they would learn the truth about the Soviet missile threat, a truth that would astonish them. When the film recovered from Discoverer 14 was developed and laid out before the intelligence analysts, The first thing that struck them was the sheer quantity of what they were seeing. A single Corona mission had photographed an enormous expanse of Soviet territory, far more than any single source had ever provided. The estimates that became part of the program's legend held that this one mission had photographed more of the Soviet Union than the entire 4-year history of U-2 overflights combined. Where the U-2 had been able to photograph corridors of territory along its flight paths, the satellite, passing over the Soviet Union again and again in its orbit, had captured vast swaths of the landmass in a single mission. The analysts were no longer looking at fragments. They were looking at a substantial portion of the Soviet Union, photographed from orbit, available for systematic study. The images themselves required interpretation, and the work of analyzing them was painstaking. The resolution of the early Corona images was modest by later standards, sufficient to identify large installations, airfields, and missile sites, but not to read fine detail. The analysts pored over the images, identifying and cataloging what they found, building a picture of the Soviet military and industrial landscape that had never before been possible. They located air bases and counted the aircraft on them. They identified military installations whose existence had only been suspected. They mapped the Soviet interior in a way that years of fragmentary intelligence had never permitted. Each image added to the growing picture, and the picture was, for the first time, based on actual photographic evidence rather than on estimates and assumptions. The most important question the analysts brought to the images was the question that had driven the entire program: the question of the missile gap. How many intercontinental ballistic missiles did the Soviet Union actually possess? Where were they located? How quickly was the arsenal growing? These were the questions on which American strategy depended, the questions that had been answered, until now, only by guesswork and Soviet propaganda. The Corona images offered the first opportunity to answer them with evidence, to actually find the Soviet missile sites and count what was there. The analysts searched the images for the missile installations, for the launch complexes and the support facilities that an ICBM force would require, and they began to compile an inventory based on what they could actually see. As the analysis proceeded across the Discoverer 14 mission and the successful missions that followed it, a pattern began to emerge that ran directly counter to the prevailing fear. The analysts were not finding the vast Soviet missile arsenal that the missile gap fear had assumed. They were finding far fewer operational missile sites than the worst estimates had predicted. The Soviet Union, which Khrushchev had boasted was producing missiles like sausages, did not appear, in the photographic evidence, to possess anything like the arsenal the boasts had implied. The images suggested that the Soviet ICBM force was small, much smaller than the fearful estimates, and that the missile gap, the terrifying Soviet advantage that had shaped American politics and planning, might not exist at all. This emerging conclusion was so significant and so contrary to the prevailing assumptions that it had to be approached with caution. The analysts could not see everything. There were areas not yet photographed, and the possibility remained that missiles were located in areas the satellites had not yet covered. The conclusion that the missile gap did not exist would have to be built carefully, mission by mission, as the satellites photographed more and more of the Soviet Union, and the inventory of missile sites was compiled with growing confidence. But the direction was clear from early in the analysis. The photographic evidence was not confirming the missile gap. It was undermining it. The closed box of the Soviet Union, opened at last to American cameras, was revealing a Soviet missile force far smaller than America had feared. The implications were enormous, and they reached to the heart of American strategy and politics. If the missile gap did not exist, if the Soviet Union possessed only a handful of operational ICBMs rather than the vast arsenal that had been feared, then the entire strategic picture was different from what American leaders had believed. The United States was not behind in the missile race. It was, if anything, ahead. The fear that had driven defense spending, shaped the presidential campaign, and kept the nation anxious was based on a phantom. The Soviet Union had been bluffing, using propaganda and the appearance of strength to create an impression of capability that the reality did not support. And the secret eye in the sky had called the bluff, replacing fear with knowledge, and revealing that the feared Soviet advantage was an illusion. This was the great achievement of the program, greater even than the technical triumph of building and operating the first reconnaissance satellite. It was the achievement of replacing guesswork with knowledge at the most critical point of the Cold War, of giving American leaders an accurate picture of the Soviet threat where before they had possessed only fear-driven estimates. The detection that Corona accomplished, the thing that America's first spy satellite found when it opened its eye over the Soviet Union, was not a hidden arsenal or a secret weapon. It was the absence of the thing America most feared. It was the discovery that the missile gap was a myth and that the United States was stronger relative to its enemy than it had dared to believe. And that discovery, more than any image of any single installation, was what made Corona one of the most consequential intelligence programs in American history. The transformation of suspicion into certainty took place over the months following the success of Discoverer 14, as one Corona mission after another added to the photographic record of the Soviet Union. The first successful mission had suggested that the Soviet missile force was smaller than feared. The missions that followed confirmed it, photographing more and more of the Soviet landmass, allowing the analysts to search systematically for missile installations and to compile an inventory based on comprehensive coverage rather than on the partial glimpse that a single mission provided. As the coverage grew, the conclusion hardened from a tentative suggestion into a confident assessment. The Soviet Union did not possess a large intercontinental ballistic missile force. It possessed a very small one. The numbers, as they emerged from the analysis, were startling in their contrast with the prevailing fears. The missile gap estimates had imagined a Soviet arsenal of hundreds of operational ICBMs, a force that dwarfed the American arsenal and threatened the United States with overwhelming nuclear attack. The photographic evidence revealed something entirely different. The Soviet Union, at the time of the early Corona missions, possessed only a handful of operational intercontinental ballistic missiles, a number that could be counted on the fingers of one or two hands, rather than reckoned in the hundreds. The Soviet ICBM program was real, and it was growing, but in 1960 and 1961, it was in its infancy, far behind where the fearful estimates had placed it, and far behind the American missile program. The missile gap, the central strategic fear of the era, was not merely smaller than believed. It was, in the most important sense, non-existent. And to the extent that a gap existed at all, it favored the United States. This was an intelligence finding of the first magnitude, and it reached the highest levels of the American government. President Eisenhower, who had authorized the program and understood its value, received the assessment with the satisfaction of a leader whose patient investment in reconnaissance had paid off. Eisenhower had long suspected that the missile gap was exaggerated, had resisted the political pressure to massively expand American missile programs in response to a threat he doubted was real, and had been criticized for his restraint. The photographic evidence vindicated his judgment. The Soviet missile force was small, and the enormous expansion that the missile gap fear had demanded was not, in strategic terms, necessary. Eisenhower had been right to doubt the gap, and the satellites proved it. The finding became politically charged as it intersected with the transition of power in Washington. The presidential campaign of 1960 had featured the missile gap prominently, with the Democratic candidate John Kennedy citing the alleged Soviet missile advantage as evidence of Republican failure and arguing for a vigorous American response. Kennedy had won the election in part on this argument. When Kennedy took office in January 1961 and was briefed on the actual intelligence, including the Corona findings, he learned that the missile gap on which he had campaigned did not exist. The Soviet missile force was small, the American force was larger, and the strategic picture was the reverse of what the campaign rhetoric had claimed. It was an awkward discovery for a new president, learning that a central premise of his campaign had been false. But it was also a profoundly important one, because it meant that the United States was operating from a position of strength rather than weakness. The knowledge the satellites provided changed the strategic calculus in ways that extended throughout the Kennedy administration and beyond. Knowing that the Soviet missile force was small, American leaders could approach confrontations with the Soviet Union with a confidence that accurate knowledge made possible. During the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the Soviet Union attempted to place missiles in Cuba, American leaders understood the actual balance of strategic forces, knew that the United States held a substantial advantage in intercontinental missiles, and could calibrate their response with that knowledge in mind. The Soviet attempt to place missiles in Cuba was, in part, an effort to compensate for the very strategic inferiority that the reconnaissance had revealed, and American leaders, knowing the true balance, could respond from a position of understood strength. The intelligence the program provided was not merely a satisfying correction of a mistaken estimate. It was a foundation for sound decision-making at the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. The deeper significance of the no-missile gap finding lay in what it demonstrated about the value of knowledge over fear. For years, the United States had operated on the basis of a frightening assumption that turned out to be false. The assumption had driven spending, shaped politics, and generated anxiety, all in response to a threat that did not exist at the scale feared. The reconnaissance replaced the assumption with evidence, and the evidence was reassuring. The enemy was not as strong as feared. The danger, while real, was smaller than imagined. And armed with this accurate knowledge, the United States could make better decisions, avoid both dangerous complacency and dangerous overreaction, and navigate the Cold War with a clearer understanding of the actual balance of power. The thing that America's first spy satellite detected over the Soviet Union was, in the end, the truth. And the truth was that America was safer and stronger than it had feared. In an age of nuclear weapons, where miscalculation could mean catastrophe, the gift of accurate knowledge was beyond price, and the eye in the sky had delivered it. The knowledge the program provided did not merely correct a mistaken estimate. It rewrote the strategic logic of the Cold War, and it did so in ways that made the dangerous confrontation between the superpowers more stable rather than less. This is one of the great paradoxes of reconnaissance, and it is essential to understanding why Corona mattered so profoundly. One might assume that the ability to spy on an enemy would heighten tensions, would feed an arms race, would make conflict more likely. In this case, the opposite was true. The knowledge it provided reduced the danger of catastrophic miscalculation, and in the nuclear age, miscalculation was the deadliest threat of all. Consider the situation that had prevailed before the satellites flew. The United States, uncertain of Soviet capability and fearing the worst, was driven by that fear toward an ever larger military buildup. Each increment of American expansion, undertaken in response to a feared Soviet threat, appeared to the Soviet Union as an aggressive move requiring a response, and the Soviet response in turn fed American fears, driving further American expansion. This is the dynamic of an arms race, in which fear and uncertainty on both sides drive a spiral of escalation that neither side fully controls. Uncertainty was the fuel of this spiral, because in the absence of knowledge, each side assumed the worst about the other and responded accordingly. The reconnaissance, by replacing uncertainty with knowledge, removed some of that fuel. When the United States learned, through this reconnaissance, that the Soviet missile force was small, it gained the ability to resist the pressure for unlimited expansion. There was no need to build hundreds of missiles to match a Soviet arsenal that did not exist. The accurate knowledge allowed American leaders to size their forces to the actual threat rather than to the feared one, to avoid the wasteful and destabilizing overreaction that the missile gap fear had demanded. This was a stabilizing effect. A United States that knew the true balance of power could act with restraint where restraint was appropriate, rather than being driven by fear into an expansion that would have alarmed the Soviet Union and accelerated the arms race. The stabilizing value of accurate knowledge became most apparent during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, the most dangerous confrontation of the entire Cold War. When the Soviet Union attempted to place nuclear missiles in Cuba within easy striking distance of the United States, American leaders faced a decision that could have led to nuclear war. In making that decision, they had the benefit of accurate intelligence about the overall strategic balance, intelligence that Corona and other reconnaissance had provided. They knew that the United States held a substantial advantage in intercontinental missiles. They understood that the Soviet move in Cuba was, in part, an attempt to offset that American advantage by placing shorter-range missiles close to the United States. This understanding shaped the American response, allowing President Kennedy to act with a calibrated firmness rather than with the blind aggression that fear and ignorance might have produced. The accurate knowledge of the strategic balance was one of the factors that allowed the crisis to be resolved without war. The Soviet motivation in Cuba, indeed, can be understood partly as a consequence of the very strategic inferiority that the reconnaissance had revealed. Khrushchev knew that the Soviet Union was behind in intercontinental missiles, knew that the boasts about missile superiority had been bluffs, and knew that the United States was aware of the true balance. Placing missiles in Cuba was a way to compensate for this inferiority, to gain a measure of strategic leverage by positioning weapons close to American territory. The crisis, in this sense, was a product of the strategic reality that Corona had documented, and the American response was shaped by the knowledge of that reality. Both sides, in the end, understood the actual balance of power, and that shared understanding, however dangerous the crisis became, helped to keep it from escalating into the catastrophe that mutual ignorance might have produced. Beyond the specific crises, Corona became the silent foundation of American strategy throughout the 1,960 seconds. Mission after mission, the satellites photographed the Soviet Union, building an ever more complete picture of Soviet military capability, monitoring the growth of the Soviet missile force as it expanded through the decade, tracking the development of new weapons and the construction of new installations. American leaders, for the first time, could base their decisions on accurate current knowledge of what the Soviet Union was actually doing, rather than on guesswork and fear. This knowledge informed arms control negotiations, allowing the United States to verify Soviet compliance with agreements through its own reconnaissance, rather than relying on Soviet honesty. It informed defense planning, allowing American forces to be sized and structured to meet the actual threat. It informed crisis decision-making, providing the factual foundation on which sound decisions could be made. The transformation that Corona wrought was, in this sense, a transformation from a Cold War fought in the dark to a Cold War fought with the lights on, at least for the United States. The United States could see its enemy, could assess its capabilities, could distinguish real threats from bluffs and propaganda. This did not end the Cold War or eliminate its dangers, but it changed the character of the competition in a fundamental way. Knowledge replaced fear at the center of American strategic thinking, and knowledge, in the nuclear age, was a force for stability. The secret eye in the sky, opened after 13 failures and maintained in the deepest secrecy, had given the United States the most valuable possession a nation can have in a dangerous confrontation, the ability to see its adversary clearly and to act on the basis of truth rather than fear. The success of Discoverer 14 was not the end of the program, but the beginning of its real work. Over the 12 years that followed, from 1960 to 1972, the United States flew more than 100 reconnaissance missions, launching satellite after satellite into orbit to photograph the Soviet Union and other areas of intelligence interest. What had begun as a desperate gamble, sustained through 13 failures, became a routine and reliable capability, an eye in the sky that opened again and again, building over the years a photographic record of unprecedented scope and detail. By the time it ended, the program had returned more than 800,000 images, a vast archive documenting the Soviet Union and the world across more than a decade. The technology improved continuously across the life of the program. The early Corona cameras had provided resolution sufficient to identify large installations, but the engineers refined the cameras steadily, improving the resolution until later missions could resolve objects on the ground with remarkable clarity, distinguishing details that the early missions could never have captured. The program introduced stereo cameras, photographing each area from 2 angles so that analysts could perceive the terrain in 3 dimensions and measure the heights of structures. It introduced multiple recovery capsules on a single satellite, allowing longer missions that returned film in installments rather than all at once. Each improvement extended the program's capability, and each was incorporated while maintaining the reliable operation that had been so hard to achieve. The program that had failed 13 times in a row became one of the most dependable intelligence systems the United States possessed. The impact of the program on the practice of intelligence was transformative and permanent. Before it, intelligence about closed societies like the Soviet Union had been gathered through spies, defectors, intercepted communications, and the fragmentary glimpses provided by aircraft like the U-2. These sources were valuable but limited, dangerous, and incomplete. The reconnaissance satellite introduced a fundamentally new capability, the systematic photographic surveillance of an entire country from orbit, secure from interference, repeatable at will, comprehensive in coverage. It established satellite reconnaissance as a foundational tool of national intelligence, and that tool has remained central to the intelligence of every major power from that day to this. The satellites that monitor the world today are its descendants, and they perform, with vastly greater capability, the function that Corona pioneered. One of the most consequential effects of satellite reconnaissance was its role in making arms control possible. The great difficulty of any arms control agreement between adversaries is verification. How can one nation trust that another is complying with an agreement to limit weapons when the other nation is a closed society that could cheat in secret? Before satellite reconnaissance, this problem was nearly insurmountable, because verification would have required intrusive inspections that neither side would permit. Satellite reconnaissance solved the problem. A nation could verify its adversary's compliance with an arms control agreement by photographing its territory from orbit, counting its missiles, and monitoring its installations, without any need for the adversary's cooperation. This capability, which the program pioneered, became enshrined in arms control agreements under the term National Technical Means of Verification, a euphemism for reconnaissance satellites. The arms control agreements that helped to stabilize the Cold War and to reduce the danger of nuclear war were made possible, in part, by the ability to verify compliance from space, an ability that began with the first reconnaissance satellites. The program itself was eventually superseded by more advanced reconnaissance satellites, systems with greater capability that built on the foundation Corona had established. The program ended in 1972, having completed its mission and having been replaced by its more capable successors. But its existence remained secret. For decades after the program ended, the public knew nothing of it, of the 13 failures, of the midair recoveries, of the images that had dispelled the missile gap. The program had been conducted under the deepest secrecy, behind the discoverer cover story, and that secrecy was maintained long after the program itself had concluded. The men and women who had built and operated Corona, who had endured the failures and achieved the successes, who had given the United States its eye in the sky, could not speak of what they had done. The secrecy ended in 1995, 35 years after Discoverer 14, and 23 years after the program concluded. In that year, President Clinton signed an executive order declassifying the program, revealing its existence to the public for the first time, and releasing the historical imagery it had gathered. The declassification allowed the story of Corona to be told at last, allowed the people who had built it to receive recognition for their work, and made the historical imagery available to scientists, historians, and the public. The images, decades old by the time they were released, found new uses, documenting environmental changes, archaeological sites, and historical conditions across the areas they had photographed. The secret program that had helped to win the Cold War became, in its declassification, a gift to scholarship and to the historical record. The story, once it could be told, took its place among the great achievements of the Cold War. Less famous than the moon landing, but, in the judgment of many who understood it, comparable in its importance. The moon landing had been a triumph of inspiration and national prestige. The program had been a triumph of intelligence and strategic stability, a program that gave the United States the knowledge it needed to navigate the most dangerous confrontation in human history without stumbling into catastrophe. The Eye in the Sky, opened after 13 failures and maintained in secret for 35 years, had watched over the Cold War, and what it saw had helped to keep the peace. It was, in the end, one of the most successful and most consequential programs the United States ever undertook, and for most of its existence, almost no one knew it existed at all. The deepest lesson of the program is that in the Cold War, and perhaps in any confrontation between great powers, the ability to see clearly was a weapon as decisive as any missile. This is a lesson that runs counter to the way we usually think about national power. We measure strength in terms of weapons, in the number of missiles and the size of armies, and the destructive power of arsenals. These things matter, of course, but the reconnaissance demonstrated that knowledge, the simple ability to see what an adversary is actually doing, can be as important as any weapon, and in some circumstances more important. The United States did not defeat the Soviet Union with Corona's cameras, but its cameras gave the United States an advantage in the most fundamental resource of any competition, the resource of accurate information, and that advantage shaped the entire course of the Cold War. Consider the asymmetry that the program created. The United States, through these satellites and their successors, could see inside the Soviet Union. It could count Soviet missiles, monitor Soviet installations, track Soviet developments. The Soviet Union, by contrast, operated in significant part on the basis of secrecy, concealing its capabilities and projecting an image of strength through propaganda and bluff. This asymmetry favored the United States profoundly. The United States could distinguish Soviet reality from Soviet propaganda, could see through the bluffs, could base its decisions on what the Soviet Union was actually doing, rather than on what the Soviet Union claimed to be doing. The Soviet Union's secrecy, which it regarded as a source of strength, became in some ways a weakness, because it meant that Soviet capabilities were assessed by American reconnaissance rather than presented on Soviet terms. The closed society could be photographed from orbit. The open eye of the United States could see what the closed Soviet Union tried to hide. The stabilizing power of this clear vision was, as we have seen, one of its most important effects. In the nuclear age, the greatest danger was not the deliberate launching of a war, which both sides understood would be catastrophic for all, but the accidental slide into war through miscalculation, through fear, through the misreading of an adversary's intentions and capabilities. Accurate knowledge was the antidote to miscalculation. A nation that could see its adversary clearly was less likely to misjudge the adversary's strength, less likely to overreact to a perceived threat, less likely to stumble into a war that neither side wanted. Corona, by giving the United States clear vision of the Soviet Union, reduced the danger of the catastrophic miscalculation that was the deadliest threat of the nuclear age. Seeing clearly was not merely an advantage. It was a contribution to the survival of both nations, and indeed, of the world. There is a profound irony in the relationship between secrecy and strength that this story reveals. The Soviet Union believed that secrecy made it strong, that by hiding its capabilities and concealing its weaknesses, it could project power and intimidate its adversaries. And in the short term, the bluff worked. The missile gap fear, fed by Soviet secrecy and Soviet propaganda, genuinely frightened the United States and shaped American policy. But secrecy is a fragile foundation for strength, because it depends on the adversary remaining ignorant, and once the adversary can see clearly, the bluff collapses. When the eye in the sky opened over the Soviet Union, the Soviet bluff was exposed. The missile gap was revealed as a myth. The projected strength was shown to be, in significant part, an illusion. The secrecy that the Soviet Union had relied upon became worthless the moment the United States could photograph the Soviet interior from orbit. Strength built on secrecy proved to be no strength at all once the secret was seen. The American approach, by contrast, was built on a different foundation, and it proved more durable. The United States did not rely on bluff. It relied on actually possessing the capabilities it claimed, and on knowing, through reconnaissance, the true balance of power. This foundation of knowledge and real capability was sturdier than the Soviet foundation of secrecy and bluff. When the truth came out, as it did through the satellites, the American position was strengthened, because the truth was that the United States was strong. The Soviet position was weakened, because the truth was that the Soviet strength had been exaggerated. Knowledge favored the side whose real position was sound, and the real position of the United States, revealed by the reconnaissance, was sounder than either side had believed. The ultimate meaning of Corona, then, is a meaning about the power of truth in a dangerous world. In the confrontation between the superpowers, the United States invested enormous effort and ingenuity in the ability to see the truth about its adversary, and that investment paid off in ways that extended far beyond any single intelligence finding. The ability to see clearly allowed the United States to act wisely, to size its forces appropriately, to navigate crises without catastrophe, to negotiate arms control with verification, and to base its strategy on reality rather than fear. The Soviet Union, relying on secrecy and bluff, gained short-term advantages that collapsed when the truth was seen. In the long run, the side that could see won the advantage, because seeing clearly is the foundation of acting wisely, and acting wisely, sustained over decades, is what prevails. This is why the program deserves a place among the most important achievements of the Cold War, alongside the more famous triumphs of the space program. The moon landing demonstrated what the United States could do when it reached for the heavens. The reconnaissance demonstrated what the United States could achieve when it looked down at the Earth, at the closed and secretive empire of its adversary, and saw the truth. The truth, it turned out, was a weapon, and it was a weapon that the United States wielded with decisive effect. America's first spy satellite detected, over the Soviet Union, the single most valuable thing a nation can possess in a dangerous confrontation. It detected reality, and reality set America free from the fear that had gripped it, and gave it the knowledge to navigate the Cold War to its eventual peaceful end. The statistical record of Corona documents both the scale of the program's eventual success and the depth of the failure from which that success emerged. The program began with a sequence of failures so long that it has become legendary in the history of American technology. Before the first successful film recovery with Discoverer 14 in August 1960, the program had endured 13 consecutive failures, missions that failed at launch, in orbit, during re-entry, or during recovery. 13 times the program tried, and 13 times it fell short, before the 14th attempt finally brought together all the elements that had to work. The contrast between this beginning and the program's ultimate record is one of the most striking in the history of any technological effort. The ultimate record was one of sustained and prolific success. Across its operational life, from 1960 to 1972, the Corona program flew more than 100 missions, the great majority of them after the initial run of failures had been overcome. These missions returned more than 800,000 images, a photographic archive of extraordinary scope. The images documented the Soviet Union and other areas of intelligence interest in detail that had never before been available, building over the years a comprehensive record of Soviet military and industrial development. From 13 straight failures, the program had grown into one of the most productive intelligence systems the United States ever operated. The improvement in the quality of the images across the program's life measured the rapid advance of the technology. The earliest Corona missions provided ground resolution on the order of perhaps 12 meters, sufficient to identify large installations and to count major facilities, but not to resolve fine detail. Through continuous refinement, the program improved this resolution dramatically, until later missions achieved resolution on the order of 2 meters or better, sufficient to distinguish individual vehicles and to read details that the early missions could never have captured. This improvement, achieved over little more than a decade, reflected the intense pace of development and the steady accumulation of engineering experience that characterized the program. The coverage that the program achieved was its defining advantage over what had preceded it. Where the U-2 had photographed corridors of Soviet territory along its flight paths, the satellites photographed vast expanses of the Soviet landmass, mission after mission, until the comprehensive coverage allowed analysts to assess Soviet capabilities with a confidence that partial coverage could never have provided. The often cited estimate that the first successful Corona mission photographed more Soviet territory than the entire U-2 effort conveys the magnitude of the change. The Soviet Union, the largest country on Earth, could be surveyed systematically from orbit, its installations catalogued, and its developments monitored, in a way that no aircraft could ever have accomplished. The central intelligence finding, the resolution of the missile gap question, can be stated in numbers that convey how dramatically reality differed from fear. The missile gap estimates had imagined a Soviet force of hundreds of operational intercontinental ballistic missiles, a force that would have dwarfed the American arsenal. The photographic evidence revealed that the Soviet Union, at the time of the early Corona missions, possessed only a small number of operational ICBMs, a figure in the single digits or low double digits, rather than the hundreds that had been feared. The gap between the feared number and the actual number was enormous, a difference of an order of magnitude or more, and it represented the difference between a terrifying Soviet advantage and a reassuring American one. The missile gap, as a strategic reality, was revealed by the numbers to be a phantom. The recovery system that made the program possible was itself a marvel that the statistics only partly capture. The capsules that returned the film from orbit, the buckets, descended from orbital altitude, survived re-entry, deployed parachutes, and were caught in midair by recovery aircraft trailing hooks. The aircraft, initially C-119 flying boxcars and later JC-130 Hercules transports, flew their recovery patterns at altitude over the Pacific, snagging the descending capsules in midair. The technique, difficult and initially unreliable, became routine over the life of the program, and the midair recovery of objects descending from space became one of the program's signature accomplishments, a procedure that had never been performed before Corona, and that the program brought to operational reliability. The orbital parameters of the satellites underscored the security that orbit provided. The Corona satellites operated at altitudes of roughly 100 miles or more, far beyond the reach of any Soviet surface-to-air missile, and they traveled at orbital velocity, approximately 17,000 miles per hour, far too fast for any interceptor. This was the fundamental advantage over the U-2. The aircraft, flying at 13 miles altitude, had eventually been brought within reach of Soviet defenses and shot down. The satellite, flying at 100 miles and 17,000 miles per hour, was beyond any defense the Soviet Union possessed. The eye in the sky could not be closed by force, and the Soviet Union, for all its anger at being photographed, could do nothing to stop it. The final statistic in this story is the span of its secrecy. The program operated from 1960 to 1972, 12 years of operation, and then remained classified for an additional 23 years, until its declassification in 1995. For 35 years, from the launch of the first satellite to the declassification, the existence of Corona was one of the most closely held secrets of the United States government. When the declassification finally came, the more than 800,000 images were released to the public, and the story of the program, the 13 failures and the eventual triumph, the midair recoveries and the dispelling of the missile gap, could be told at last. The eye that had watched the Cold War in secret became, 3 decades after it opened, a part of the public history of the era it had helped to shape. More than half a century after the first recovery capsule was caught in midair over the Pacific, the program stands as one of the least celebrated and most consequential triumphs of the Cold War. It has none of the fame of the moon landing. There were no astronauts, no live television broadcasts, no words spoken from another world that a billion people remembered. The program was secret, and it remained secret for 35 years, and even now, decades after its declassification, it is known mainly to those who study the history of the Cold War and the history of intelligence. And yet, in the judgment of many who understand it, it was among the most important things the United States accomplished in the entire Cold War, a program that may have done as much to keep the peace as any weapon the United States ever built. The deepest meaning of the program is a meaning about the value of truth. The United States, in the late 1950 seconds, was a nation gripped by fear, and the fear was based on ignorance. It feared a Soviet missile arsenal that it could not see and could not measure, and in the absence of knowledge, it imagined the worst. The fear was real, the anxiety genuine, the political consequences substantial, and it was based, as the reconnaissance revealed, on a phantom. The feared Soviet arsenal did not exist at the scale imagined. The missile gap was a myth. The truth, when it was finally seen, was reassuring, and it set the nation free from a fear that had distorted its politics and driven its spending. The program did not give the United States a new weapon. It gave the United States the truth, and the truth turned out to be the most valuable thing of all. There is a contrast worth drawing between the program and the more famous triumphs of the space age, because the contrast illuminates something about the different ways a nation can succeed. The moon landing was a triumph of aspiration, a demonstration of what the United States could achieve when it reached for the impossible, a source of inspiration and national pride that echoed around the world. It was loud, public, and glorious. The reconnaissance effort was its opposite in every respect. It was silent, secret, and unglamorous, a program of cameras and film and patient analysis, conducted in the shadows, known to almost no one. And yet both were triumphs, and both were essential. The moon landing showed the world what America could do. It showed America what the Soviet Union was actually doing, and in doing so, it gave America the knowledge to navigate the most dangerous confrontation in human history without stumbling into catastrophe. The one was a triumph of inspiration, the other was a triumph of wisdom. A great nation needs both. The legacy of the program surrounds us today, though few are aware of it. Every reconnaissance satellite that watches over the world, every orbital eye that monitors the movements of armies and the construction of weapons and the compliance with treaties, is a descendant of the effort that opened its eye after 13 failures over the Pacific in 1960. The capability that it pioneered, the systematic observation of the Earth from orbit, has become a permanent feature of the modern world, woven into the security of nations and the verification of agreements and the management of the dangerous business of relations between armed powers. The eye that opened in 1960 has never closed. It has only multiplied and improved, watching over a world that depends, more than it knows, on the ability to see clearly that Corona first provided. There is, finally, a lesson in the 13 failures that preceded the first success. A lesson that connects this program to the larger story of the American space effort. 13 times the program failed, and 13 times it tried again, refusing to abandon a goal that mattered too much to surrender. The same persistence that carried Corona through its failures carried the Apollo program to the moon, carried the American space effort from the humiliation of the exploding Vanguard to the triumph of the lunar landing. It was a persistence rooted in the conviction that difficult problems could be solved through disciplined, sustained effort, through the willingness to fail and learn and try again. The reconnaissance program was an early and severe test of that conviction, and the conviction held, and the holding of it gave the United States an eye in the sky that helped to keep the peace for a generation. The thing that America's first spy satellite detected over the Soviet Union was, in the end, more than the absence of a missile gap, more than the count of Soviet installations, more than any single intelligence finding. It detected the truth in a confrontation that had been governed by fear, and it brought that truth home, caught in a capsule snatched from the sky, to a nation that desperately needed it. The truth was that America was stronger than it had feared, safer than it had believed, and capable, through its ingenuity and its persistence, of seeing clearly in a world of dangerous shadows. The eye opened, and the shadows lifted, and the United States navigated the rest of the Cold War with the priceless advantage of knowing, rather than fearing, what its adversary was truly doing. That was the achievement of Corona, and it was an achievement worthy of a place among the greatest of the age, even if, for 35 years, almost no one knew that it had happened at all. If this account of America's secret eye in the sky revealed a side of the space race you had never heard, consider subscribing to Space Race Tales. Every week, we bring you the untold stories of the Cold War cosmos, the cosmonauts and astronauts who flew impossible missions, the engineers who built impossible machines, and the secrets that two superpowers spent decades hiding from the world. The space race was fought not only for glory but for survival, and its untold stories are only beginning to come to light. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join us for the next chapter.